It's the daunting task of reflecting on this incredibly rich day. So no pressure. I'll just briefly introduce you and leave as much time to your comments and questions and so on. So first we have Mark Kawakami here. He's
That's good enough.
Okay, and Nicky.
Nice. Yeah, no, I'm Mark. All right.
Hi, Brooke. Well, just bear with me. You're an assistant professor of private law at Maastricht University, and also a researcher for the Dutch sector plan on globalization and law, conducting multidisciplinary inquiry into answering the questions of what makes private actors behave in a pro-social manner. And also I find very interesting that you're the director of the Maastricht Mediation Clinic, and you do a lot more, but for time's sake, I'll leave it at that. We have, so I'll end with Corinne. So Nicky is a PhD researcher at the Open University of the Netherlands. Her research project deals with the access to information for victims of human rights violations in civil litigation against multinational corporations. And she's also a member of a Vichy research project based here at the University of Amsterdam that's called Rethinking Secondary Liability for International Crimes. And she was a visiting researcher at the UCLA School of Law and has worked for several law firms and has a very rich background in that respect as well. And then our third panelist online, Corinne, thank you so much for joining us. You had to get up at a ridiculously early hour to join us today. And I understand you didn't sleep too well. So talking about care responsibilities. And so I think it's quite fitting that we need to actually just apparently go on with the lack of sleep. Being very well aware of that, we appreciate it all the more that you are joining us for this final panel. And Corinne is the executive director of the Law and Political Economy Project. For those who don't know it yet and want to check it out, it's lpeproject.org. And she's an associate research scholar at Yale Law School. And her research draws on her education in law and critical theory to explore how our political economy and market logic transform and limit the ways we imagine our society and the role of government in it. And I want to start with you, Corinne, and then we move over to our panelists here, because this morning, and I think maybe you were not there for the first panel or maybe the first panel and a half, but LPE received some criticism from the people here in the room. So for instance, from Parvati, who said,
Corinne, I love you.
Correct me. Corinne, I love you. And then she said, I hope I'm quoting this correctly. LPE is a response to post-structuralism while resisting the venture back to Marxism. And then there was also the criticism that LPE is basically a US-centric project.
That was wrong.
So perhaps you could respond to that with your experience and maybe reflect on how you use LPE or how you think it is useful in addressing issues of race and gender.
Okay, thank you guys so much for having me. This has been, as mentioned, it started at 3 a.m. for me, so I didn't join until the second panel. And so I am very tired. My dog also had a stomach bug last night, which also means I unfortunately have to leave right at noon which is 6 for you guys to take him to the vet. So I have some time, but just know that I have a hard stop. Thanks so much also to Ivana and everyone else who did all the labor to sort of like bring this together. I will say it's always a little weird to enter these rooms as like the defender of LPE. I think in some ways, like it totally makes sense. It is my job. I like very much function as the LPE hype man. That said, it is not always exactly aligned with my particular sort of like scholarly bent. And so, but I think probably the most useful thing for me to do would be to try and occupy the sort of like the more formal role. Although, as my boss, I'm sure, would like me to say, I'm not speaking for LPE in any sort of like official capacity. I mean, the other way I enter this room is as an American, and virtually for that matter. And so I think that Parvati's like comment is in many ways really true, right? Like there are a number of things that really resonate there for me, which is that like listening in on these conversations, realizing where the conversation is among European scholars versus where it is in the US is like night and day. I think that it's pretty remarkable. And sometimes I think about the fact that like, you know, critical legal studies or sort of like a critical approach to law didn't die in the same way. And so like, if you didn't sort of like systematically root them out, or they didn't become obsessed with post-structuralism in the 80s, then you have a different sort of lineage. And so I guess I do think to some degree, LPE is responding to the historical moment inside US law schools that like there really was no materialism. Like I think that post-structuralism also really got rooted out, but like there essentially was no leftist project and certainly nothing that like really took sort of like material and economic things seriously. And so in that way, obviously, like it is very uniquely American. Also, the other thing that gets brought up a lot is like the degree to which it engages with law and economics, which I do also think is like to some degree like a US phenomenon. Although I do want to quibble with the idea about returning to Marxism, because like I don't actually want to, I want to say that even before the turn to post-structuralism, Marxism was never really present in the US Legal Academy. And so I do think that like that trajectory isn't quite so neat. And so as much as I don't see it so much as like a refusal of, I mean, to the identification that it's a sort of like middle path of like not turning fully to Marxism is right. Like there's no question that that's true. I also think that that was never on the table. There's not a critical mass of Marxist scholars inside the US. And so like that just, it wouldn't be a movement in any sort of like meaningful way. And so like, what is it that we're doing? Oh, but I do want to also affirm one more thing that Parvati said, which is that if you're already using the language of Marxism, there's absolutely no reason you need to switch to law and political economy. Like that is not our project. Like we are not making that argument. And so, but I've used Michael Denning to do this before, but I think that to some degree, how I like to understand LPE, again, to what degree this is taken up more generally, I think is different, but it's sort of like a continuum of sort of like those critiquing political economy to those sort of doing political economy, right? And I think there are a number of reasons why that's true. I think that to some degree, it comes out of this like relationship to policy. I mean, I feel like this was echoed in a couple of the comments that were made today, specifically about people who were engaging in like very particular sort of like contemporary legal issues about sort of like, how do we make those sort of compromises about reform versus sort of like a more radical horizon? And I think that to some degree, LPE grows out of that tension, because I think that as it's been fashioned, it very much is focused on this idea of sort of like having a concrete impact sort of like in this particular moment. And so, and at its best, it is not doing it in a way that legitimates capitalism and sort of like papers over and makes sort of like a kinder, gentler face, which isn't to say that it doesn't do that. But I do think that there are people within it that are trying to imagine a different kind of sort of reform. And I think that the language of non-reformist reforms has been probably the dominant circulating one within LPE. I think people have very understandable problems with that as a concept. But I do think this idea that like that it's not really just about reform treating a particular issue, but looking towards one that builds power in some sort of meaningful way, or sort of like creates mass community or mass organizations in ways that then I mean, because if you don't believe that law is the thing that's going to save you, you still can believe that law can help facilitate the kinds of structures that, or more likely, get in the way. And so to some degree, it can be about how you sort of get law out of the way in those ways. Oh, this is just a lot of me talking. Okay. But I think that if non-reformist reforms is not the way you want to think about it, I mean, I do think that to think about it instead as like sort of strategic reforms, right? Like that you don't get sort of, to bastardize something that Rob has said in writing, is like, you don't get sort of like preoccupied with the tactical at the expense of sort of like thinking strategically and long-term. And so like, I do think that, but I think doing that oftentimes means engaging inside the system. Like there's no real way to have a relationship to policy right now that is not about that. And so I think it, yeah. Okay, so why it might still be useful. So maybe I'm just a comparativist at heart, but like I do think that the fact that it really comes out of the US and that a lot of the things in it right now are very US focused is not necessarily like, I think that's a problem in like if that's what it continues to be, but I think there's real value in actually trying to think about what we learn in the sort of like process of translation. So like, I think that like identifying the way that like racialization as a process has been in many ways overly dominated by like the particular plight of African Americans as like the sort of, I mean, that is a problem sort of like within US legal scholarship as well, that like there ends up being like one sort of model. And I think that those kinds of things come from this kind of engagement, right? And so on some level, there's like a selfish part of me that's just sort of like, I think there's real value in the pushback, right? And trying to distinguish sort of like historical and geographic specificity. I think that, so we're oftentimes referred to as a big tent. So there are obviously downsides of a big tent, but there are also upsides. I think that it brings us into conversations with people that we can potentially move. I mean, I do think that I do think law and political economy has a way of, people don't immediately reify it and act like they know what it is and sort of be like, oh, that's this thing. Like it instead ends up being a space where people are like, we get to move sort of like in an incognito way because nobody has any idea what the concept of political economy means. And so there's just like a way that I think buys us movement in those spaces. Okay, and then finally, but like, so why might it still be useful, especially in thinking about race and gender? I mean, to some degree, it's grappling precisely with the questions that you guys have been grappling with today. And so it's not so much that like it offers any kind of answers, but I do think that like as a set of intellectual debates and intellectual ideas, it is really trying to think about how you center race and gender as opposed to always having them be sort of additional, right? So like, how is it that we, and we don't have answers to that. And like, I missed whatever the critique of co-constitutive was, but I like heard it sort of echo throughout the day. And I do think that like getting more precise in sort of like how we're imagining these relations, I do think is the work that's sort of before us. And I think that that to me at least feels much more sort of like, even if not always as radical as I want it to be, is a real sort of like centerpiece of LPE. And now I'm going to stop talking.
Thank you so much. This is really, really helpful and useful. Nicky, I'll pass on to you for your reflections.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. No, also for me first, a big thank you to Ivana first and the other organized party, Alicia, Guusje as well, for organizing this and bringing us all together to have a very rich discussion, I think is what we can say after hearing all these panels. And indeed, there is the daunting task of trying to capture the main themes, I think, that we discussed, especially to give a sort of a full explanation. I'm quite new to the subject, and in that sense, I'm also very grateful to be able to engage in this way with the discussions and trying to understand and capture them and summarize them a little bit. So what I want to try to do is highlight the main themes that I saw today in a semi-structured way. So I will not stick to the order of the panels, but just the recurring themes that I saw, and then add some of my thoughts on them as well. And writing the two-pager was again, I repeat that, very useful and interesting way of preparing for this. But it very much made me feel like a student, which was good, and to really grapple with the material. But for the thoughts I want to add, go a little bit beyond, because I think it might also be good, to connect it to some of the Dutch specificities. And being born and raised in the Netherlands, I hope I can do that at least a little bit, or start some of the conversation in that respect. So to start with that, we have been talking about several phenomena, I think, and we just heard more about LPE, so I will leave that there. But then, of course, there's gender and race, or as you know, the discussion evolved, I think we kept referring to gendering and racialization, because I think it's there the first thing that came about. And I think the importance of understanding and taking away from these discussions is that these concepts are not natural, nor are they fixed. And I think that's important for even starting the conversations. So then what came forward was the importance of understanding the specific circumstances also in which these terms and concepts or phenomena are being employed and are being constructed, to truly grasp their meaning. And I will get back to that, but that really made me think of something which I think is quite specific to the Dutch conversation, is a specific way of looking at whiteness, or maybe better thinking about the invisibility almost of whiteness, where you have, I think the main people who started this conversation are Philomena Esset and Gloria Becker, who both have worked on the cultural archives of how race is seen or not seen, basically, in Dutch conversations, and where sort of an idea of neutrality of whiteness and an idea of tolerance, or the self-conception of the Dutch of being a very tolerant people, makes conversations about race very difficult, very contentious. So I think, just to add some of those specific circumstances where I think this might merit a sort of understanding of race specific to the Dutch conversation. So we have our phenomena, and then in the discussions, there's the importance of looking at their interaction and how they also co-constitute each other. And we have seen an enormous variety of research that looks at these different relationships. So just to mention, and saying this, I will not do justice to be complete here, but we've seen property as a social relation and how racialization adopts to the need to protect property. We've looked at IP law and Western scientific modes of knowledge production, and the fear also of token representation when it comes to gender relations, for example. We have looked at how racialization and gendering determine the value of so many things, and how they create hierarchies, and where the importance of cheapness of labor is actually determining the value of people's lives. We have looked at Haiti's double debt and how often that and how that racialization has also allowed a situation of independence, but also dominance when it continued. We've looked at racial underpinnings of the labor market and how it is enshrined in the legal form. We've looked at work-life balance measures and how they have sort of perpetuated or become tools almost of neo-colonial or neoliberal tendencies, and how those reproduce inequalities along racial and gender lines. We have looked at how colonial law constructed a gender binary and how how important it is to also study the resistance against this binary in order to shine a light actually on their connection, and the importance of telling better stories. From the richness of all these topics, I think, or I take away different important issues, and that is first the need for granular work, the importance of looking at the details, and then also the need to show the connection instead of posing it, even though it might be so incredibly obvious to get that message across. And this also shows the needs of employing a variety of methods, and that we can still remain within the law, but that we need to bring those methods within our own discipline. And because to do that, we can connect the different frames that are already out there. Because otherwise, constitution may become an empty placeholder, and that is what we need to prevent. And this also goes for some of the other terms, like racial capitalism, which is sometimes used simply to not have to give a further explanation. And that poses a risk, basically, of veiling again what you try to unveil. And yeah, here again, it made me think of so many of the Dutch discussions that are being held, where you have almost a low-hanging fruit of discrimination with tax benefits, the discussion on reparations for slavery that is starting, but also certain health policies that are related to wages, and in that sense also determine the value of people's life and health based on their wage. I can continue, but in light of time, I will make one more point, 2-ish points, and that is also that teaching has been a recurring theme. And that on the one hand, there are easy ways to do it is by contextualizing doctrines, and which may actually help students to better understand those doctrines that we need to teach them. But on the other hand, we need to take into account the institutional demands and also the institutional positionality to see what we can do. And this, I think, for me, is a main takeaway, asks extra work of the teacher. Because it might be that you are set with a certain curriculum and you can add on to that, and that requires, to do more. And here, again, a remark on the Dutch situation, because we've talked about creating awareness of the ideology that people come in with and into the class, and I think there it's important to create safety within especially Dutch academia, I think, and understanding the difficulties of this conversation. And I think, again, and this is just to explain, I recently saw a documentary on Philomena Asset as well, which was very touching, highly recommend that, where she is at UvA actually, and is also talking to a lot of the younger students about the dismissal and that type of thing that students get confronted with if they speak up about feeling uncomfortable with certain doctrines, for example, asking certain questions from that uncomfortableness, and how important it is as teachers to validate instead of dismiss that. And then last, again, what do we want to give our students? And I think their recurring theme was, what is actually the purpose of the critique that we are developing, and to what extent can law solve and transform, and to what extent it just cannot do so. And I want to leave this open because maybe it's also good to sometimes sit with this uncomfortableness, because they're again referring to Philomena Esset, who said, without pain, there's no change.
Well,
I think we can go home now.
okay, maybe skip your part.
Yeah, we're good.
Yeah, because I mean, the length of your notes,
I-
that we're gonna be here until tomorrow.
Oh, no, this is what y'all been saying. I
Okay.
wrote down, this is me. I want to start with a little game though, because I want to invite Corinne to play along what Nicky and I were playing over lunch. And so there's this quote that's often attributed or misattributed to Edinburgh. It says, if you're at age 20, you're not a communist, you don't have a heart. If at age 30, you're not a capitalist, you don't have a brain. At age 40, which I am now, fill in the blank. What goes in the blank, right? So I think about it, if anyone has a good answer for what I should be at age 40, maybe it's still back to communist, capitalist, I don't know what I am. But in the interest of full disclosure, Lisa earlier said that you feel like an imposter because you're not a lawyer. I feel like a tourist because like Nicky, I also have a background, but I'm a corporate lawyer. I'm also, as you can probably tell, American. I'm not as bad as Larry Summers, I suppose. But it's also probably because I wasn't rich and as successful as Larry was. So these are some of the caveats that I have. So take whatever I say with a grain or a bag of sand or salt, whatever, salt, sand. So a lot of what I took away from today, which again, I'm also grateful because everyone seems to be quite grateful that I am also grateful. I don't want to sound ungrateful. I tried to sort of center it around on the three questions that Ivana posted in the beginning, right? So one was, how do you research LPE with race and gender in mind? Question two was, what are the obstacles and resistance? The third one being, what practices, ideas do you need to nurture or to overcome these obstacles and resistance? I think I tried to extrapolate the answers that y'all have provided. If I've gotten it wrong, sorry. So as far as I understand for the question one, how do you research LPE with race and gender in mind? There is no one right way, but there are wrong and weak ways to do it. So this is, as you already mentioned, the example of, and this is how, again, the co-constitutive term came in, as Nicky already said, it doesn't actually show us the relationship. People just throw this term around, in other words, like economy around as if it means something to everybody, and it's loosely defined. So the lack of specificity is sort of attributed as a weakness within this research. So don't do that, one. But then secondly, to look at the importance of holistic or interdisciplinary perspective. So not only, this is, I think, Lanya was saying, not only relying on accounts and archives of imperialists and colonizers. Oof. Continued reliance on these linear accounts is a continued form of violence. I was like, damn, I felt bad for I guess following that linear trajectory a little bit. So that was a very reflective moment for me. But that was something not just I think you said it first, but I think everyone else kind of picked up on this. So we don't want to be trapped in the language of the imperialists and colonizers. So that was sort of my general answer to question one. There's an additional addendum that I particularly enjoyed, which was Ron saying that legal pluralism you are generally suspicious of. So I thought that was a pretty good do not do to answer question one. With regards to question two, sort of what are the obstacles and resistance? And here, I think was where we spent the predominant amount of time talking in teaching, right? How do we talk about this, but at the same time have a dual purpose of creating students who are marketable? How do we send these students from a law school, which is traditionally conservative in a vocational oriented education? How do we get them to sort of think about these far-reaching questions and not just working as a lawyer? Now, I for one, Rob, I would be interested in taking your course because that sounded pretty good. So again, to question sort of our over-reliance on doctrinal methods, Davin, you asked this question, and I really thought about it too. Can you stay within the law and still say interesting things? And again, I might be paraphrasing aggressively here, which might be a form of violence in and of itself, was yes, I think you can, but it's very difficult to stay within law and say interesting things. You have to be holistic, you have to look beyond, you have to think about not just the law, but the implications, the context, what happened around the time of promulgation. So you have to read, I think a lot of authors got overlap, Williams, Robinson, Berici, Ayman, so I think these are must reads. I will try to circulate that within my international business law class. I got to figure out the right context in which to do so. But again, I think that's an obstacle that I have to think about. Again, the obstacle LP, I think Corinne answered the question about the limited use question mark. I think substantively what really I felt was the obstacle was what Bhavati started already saying, sort of like we are kind of stuck in the system that we are in. And for us to ignore the fact that we do live in a capitalistic society with imperialistic colonist background, we're still kind of pervading, but nevertheless trying to figure out a way to change the system from within, I thought is the biggest common struggle that I think we tend to have as a group. Like I said, I'm just a tourist, so if I'm wrong about that, and if it's actually not that hard, please let me know. And so here you asked the question of using our scholarship to incite systematic change can be a tricky thing, but not impossible, is what I sort of read between the lines. So how do we do it? Yes, it is possible. The things that we talk about this in this room, the theory behind it, the abstraction, might be something that never materializes, but it is nevertheless something that we have to keep pushing. And so I found not learned hopelessness, but a sense of purpose in what you guys all do. And I mean guys in a very neutral term. I'm working on it. So question three, again, I think the answer to what are the practices, ideas you need to nurture or overcome these obstacles, we're sitting in it. I think it's this workshop. I think it's getting together people from not only different backgrounds who drink the same Kool-Aid, but we invite people like me who is just kind of getting a glance of it and understand these things very superficially, yet I'm sort of completely engaged. I took notes. I think I've developed carpal tunnel today. And so I'm going to go back and have more things to read. I leave this place feeling inspired. So I think doing this, not just with a group of people who are already part of it, but to invite people, thanks for inviting me, outsiders who have not completely drank the Kool-Aid to sort of kind of get exposed to the richness of this realm. That's one, at least for me. And I think just to continue working with the fundamental understanding and the awareness of the interconnectedness of all the things that we talked about today. You can't just talk about race, which is an abstract construct, I found out. You have to talk about race, intersection of gender. Looking at it, what did I write? Terrible handwriting. Capitalism, aggression, violence, all these things are interconnected. Wow. Okay, I suppose that's true. law is not just constitutive, but part of the whole, mere part of the whole totality, which is also the word that I think kept coming. Last paragraph, and this is sort of where, having kind of tried to summarize, paraphrase what y'all have said about 3 questions, this is the plea that I have as a tourist, as someone who's not neck deep in the things that have been said. In my 2-pager, which was a 1-pager, because I thought y'all said 1 page, but anyway, it doesn't matter. One of the books that I sort of recommended was from Bell Hooks, and she talks about sort of masculinity. And so it's only tangentially related to what we're talking about. But as Lara said, I am a lawyer, but I'm a recovering lawyer in the sense that I've really gotten into mediation and sort of communication across adversarial parties. And what I heard today, and again, citing Williams, labor law for all its protection, enacted to prevent resistance from the enslaved, right? So Alman talks about there's a villainization of imperialist, capitalist, as there should be, patriarchy. But I want to find a way to bridge third worldists, Marxists, LPEers, capitalists to sort of work not against each other in an adversarial manner, but in a more collaborative manner. So Lisa also said, law has a role in increasing maintaining cheapness in global society. I think these are true statements. But regardless of how disgusting those damn capitalists might be, we still operate in a system where we cannot avoid working with them to sort of manifest a certain change. So I'm putting on my mediator hat, inspired by Hooks, to sort of say, is there a way to sort of see, even in the disgusting filth that is capitalism, I'm catering to the crowd right here, to sort of recognize the importance of Ivana's words, it's not caring. It's not just about interpersonal caring, but caring between different groups of people with different ideologies to come together. I highlighted hoping about the law. His fellow editors will likely say this is too wishy-washy and not concrete enough. And I think that's true. It's accurate. It is hoping against hope that there is a positive outcome. But I think at the end of the day, I leave with closing words, I think, Vanya as well. I think in your last presentation, you said, we don't just study the great violence. We study when there were sort of great collaborations and stories of success, not to romanticize them, because that's a dangerous practice, but to see the potential in realizing that even when there is darkness, even when there is centuries of oppression and violence, even in that circumstance, we still find some hope, some glimpse of positive, some glimpse of opportunities to collaborate. So I hope we walk away from this with not a newfound appreciation for capitalists, but the tolerance to nevertheless keep talking with them. Me. I don't know. That's the one thing.